They recognized in Jesus something special, but they wondered if they were mistaken when he died. They didn't anticipate that. Suffer maybe, but die at the hands of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor? In fact, even when the first reports of his resurrection reached their ears, they were still doubtful and skeptical. But when they met the risen Lord, their skepticism was transformed into a very confident faith, a great joy, and a determination to preach the good news to everyone else. And I think that's the part that's awfully hard to refute, because we have this turnabout, this transformation of a discouraged and bewildered following on the basis of the good news.
Somehow you have to explain the explosion from scared followers who run away to, let's worship him, let's sing to him, let's pray to him.
If there was no resurrection, and more to the point, if there was no resurrection appearances of Jesus, to those who doubted and were discouraged and denied and betrayed Jesus, we would not be sitting here talking about this today.
Other messianic figures had risen in the past, had claimed to be somebody, and had been suppressed and killed by the Romans. Yet no movement arose around those dead messiahs. But these disciples of Jesus were willing to go to the ends of the earth proclaiming the gospel message. Were willing to suffer and die for that. The transformation from a bunch of defeated cowards to boldly, fearlessly proclaiming the gospel, even to the point of death, to me confirms that something happened on that first Easter morning.
I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 2 Corinthians 11:23.
After Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples lived lives of hardship for 20, 30, 40 years, suffered greatly in their ministries, and eventually suffered martyrdom and execution without recanting for their belief that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead.
I mean, what were they gaining? Were they becoming rich? They're running around the countryside. They're, in some cases, abandoning their family for periods of time so they can preach. What they got for their efforts is death, in many cases.
You also have to remember that the disciples died not just for something they believed was true. They died for something they actually saw with their own eyes. It's much more difficult to explain that away than it is for someone who dies for a belief and they're sincerely wrong.
I came across a bit of evidence I really found fascinating. James was a half-brother of Jesus, and he was not a believer in Jesus during Jesus' lifetime, but he later died the death of a martyr as a leader of the local church. In a similar way, Saul of Tarsus was a persecutor of Christians, and yet he later becomes the Apostle Paul, this incredible missionary. So I had to ask myself, what led to this radical transformation of these skeptics?
Sometimes people will come to believe something they wish to be true. If you believe hard enough that a person is loving and kind, you can talk yourself into believing that, even though the person is not loving and kind. It's very, very difficult, however, to explain people coming to believe something that they're actually standing against. Now, in the case of James and Paul, they did not believe in Jesus before his crucifixion. In fact, they thought he was deranged, and they did not accept what he said and what he taught.
James, a brother of Jesus, is a skeptic who doesn't come to Jesus until he meets the risen Lord. Critics allow that. Paul's a persecutor till he meets the risen Jesus. That's not the kind of testimony of someone who all gets together and say, hey, let's just cook this thing up.
One of the certainties, it seems to me, related to the testimony of the apostles is that they truly believed that Jesus was who he claimed he was, and they truly believed that he had risen from the dead, because they were willing to die for that. Very few people are willing to die for something they don't really believe in, or something even worse that they know to be a lie.
When Jesus was executed, his disciples were rightly afraid. They scattered. They were fearful for their own life. Their hopes had been dashed because they had believed Jesus was the promised one who was going to usher a new day in for Israel. Turned out he wasn't, because he was murdered by crucifixion under the authority of the Roman Empire. And yet, shortly thereafter, we find them taking a stand in Jerusalem, proclaiming that Jesus was the Messiah, the very Son of God. How do we explain that? How do we explain the fact that they were even willing to propagate this the rest of their lives and go to martyrs' deaths for their belief? The only rational explanation is that something happened to them between the death of Jesus and 3 days later, and according to their own words, it was that they saw Jesus risen from the dead for themselves.
People have often said, and I think it's a perfectly fair position, that, okay, there aren't actually any good alternative hypotheses for how you explain the rise of early Christianity, but because we know as an absolute fact which we're not prepared to let go of, that nobody ever rises from the dead, then there must in fact be some other alternative hypothesis. And I want to say, okay, if you want to make the absoluteness of bodily death the cornerstone of your entire worldview, I actually can't stop you. If you choose to say, no, here I stand, death is the end, and nobody ever comes back from it, and that's just the way it is, well, that's where a lot of people were in the ancient world, it's where a lot of people are in the modern world. I think that that worldview is radically challenged by the strong evidence which points to the resurrection of Jesus, but it's up to somebody what they do with that challenge.
The evidence accumulated over time until November the 8th of 1981, which is sort of when I reached a critical mass. I remember going alone in my room, and I took a yellow legal pad and put a line down the middle, and on one side I started to list all of the evidence I had encountered for Jesus Christ being the Son of God, and on the other side all the negative evidence against that. And I wrote and I wrote page after page, and finally I put my pen down and I said, wait a minute. In light of this avalanche of evidence pointing toward the truth of Christianity, it would require more faith for me to maintain my atheism than to become a follower of Jesus Christ. And so that's the moment that I decided, consistent with the evidence, the most logical, the most rational step I could take was a step of faith in the same direction the evidence was pointing, and put my trust in Jesus. And after I did that, I thought, you know, maybe Leslie would like to hear about this.
I thought it was too good to be true. My heart was pounding. I was in tears. I was so excited. I just threw my arms around him and kissed him and hugged him and told him how I'd been praying and how lots of people had been praying that this day would come.
She threw her arms around me and she said, "You hard-hearted son of a Baptist," she said, "I've been telling you this for 2 years. I mean, come on." And that began a transformational process for me, where over time my philosophy and my attitudes, relationships, parenting, worldview, all of that began to change over time for good, really for good.
When Lee became a Christian, his whole life started to change, to the extent that our 5-year-old daughter, who also saw those changes, went to her Sunday school teacher and told her that she wanted Jesus to do in her life what he had done in her daddy's life.
Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And you know, that's my story. It was someone who said, I'm going to investigate this stuff with an open mind, let it take me wherever the evidence will take me. And what I discovered in the end is Jesus made the claim that he is the truth, that everything hinges on his identity. In fact, everything hinges on the resurrection, because anybody can claim to be the Son of God. If Jesus really did return from the dead, then he is who he claimed to be, and that changes everything. But what about your own journey? I'd really encourage you, if you've never done it, to investigate the evidence for yourself, but make 3 resolutions up front. Number 1, make it a front burner issue in your life. Number 2, resolve to have an open mind, to go wherever the evidence takes you, even if it takes you to the very uncomfortable conclusion that Jesus is who he claimed to be. And then finally, resolve that once the evidence is in, you will reach a verdict in the case for Christ.